issues are seem to be stemming from the beginning of the supply chain, right? Where we need all the raw materials. A lot of this stuff we're not really that, I guess, secure with the United States. It's what we've been failing on, what we've been lacking on, all these things that we've been outsourcing. We do a lot of the services, the design work. We do a lot of the hard work, the intellectual part, and then we send it off to somewhere else. And usually not our friends, right? Chasing that dollar. And I'm really
They were our friends.
Yeah,
They
our
were
friends.
our friends.
So we thought, right? Yeah, but
explain that executive order 14017, right? And say, that kind of built this resilient structure for President Biden to now see things that he's now making decisions on. And they don't. Before I let you go, I just want to point out that 2 years ago he wrote this executive order, right? Or it came out 2 years ago, 2021.
February, yeah.
2 years of information to build to a point to where now he can make some decisions that impact policy. So go ahead and just kind of talk to us about that executive order, and we can then start to come up to modern day after that.
Yeah, definitely. So key important part here is before this executive order, a lot of supply chain resilience was dealt at the private sector. It was managed by companies. Do what you need to do, get their supply chain resilience you need. Well, this has led to a big problem, as we're starting to see now. Like I kept saying, semiconductors. There's different with batteries now. It's a big issue. Raw materials is another big issue, which is China is really getting ahead of us on. And so this executive order really tries to bring in the federal government now into bringing in strategy into the American supply chain. It seems to be a void in having an overall consensus on American supply chain strategy. Everybody, like I said, was going their own ways, doing their own thing. And this really hasn't benefited us. Being a capitalistic society that we're in, companies are in to making money. So having this short-term viewpoint of, all right, let's save the most money, let's outsource everything, and let's give all our IP away, let's rely on other countries. And this really came to really bite us in the butt now, as we're seeing now with a lot of these supply chain constraints. And this executive order, mind you, President Biden put this into place only several months after being in the office. That's how big of a deal it is. But it really addresses some of these shortfalls. And what it actually was a 100-day review that the president assigned to key departments of the government, the federal government. Those were the Department of Defense, Commerce and Homeland Security, Energy, Agriculture, Transportation, Health and Human Services. So what he ordered that all these different departments of the federal government go out and do a 100-day study, identify what the shortfalls are, what's critical, what do we need to address now, and then also give recommendations on how to do that, which actually just came out recently.
Yeah, I think that the order, you kind of, I'll peel back a second, but the departments he pegged were key elements of any supply chain: health, logistics, technology, defense, all the different things, the key elements of any supply chain. So to kind of explain
that. Oh, sorry.
No. So go ahead.
No, I just wanted to also add there that these are the key critical areas where we're having a lot of issues with. Right. So there's things such as materials, right? Large capacity batteries for vehicles. We're trying to go into electric vehicles, and now we can't even get the batteries to do it. And then also, like you said, pharmaceutical ingredients, as we saw through COVID. This really all stemmed from COVID, which really showed, right, all the vulnerabilities within our supply chain.
That's what I was going to talk about. So the strategy before the pandemic, we'll kind of use that as the marking point. Before that, it was globalization. In other words, my country does this really well, your country does that really well. We'll trade and barter and build this. We had a lot of free trade agreements that reduced trade barriers, and it enabled a lot of free trade. So that's when you said before is what were the businesses doing? They were making the best profit. Like, okay, I can manufacture in cheaper labor zones such as China, where I can reduce my labor costs significantly. So that's why our manufacturing base went over there, right? And pharmaceuticals, same thing, went over there, the belief was, or the perception, I believe, was that China was a good manufacturing base.
Yep.
And then China, in some reports I started reading back in 2002, started making some major shifts into controlling the what used to be known as the Silk Road, now the Chinese are building another trade route around the world. And that's where
Yep.
they're capturing key components of all supply chains. And like, you mentioned pharmaceuticals. They have the key ingredients to the pharmaceuticals. Not all the ingredients, they just have the key ones that make the pharmaceuticals work. Batteries. They own lithium mines around the world. They don't know all the stuff about batteries, just the key piece that makes them all work. And then the pandemic happened. And that's when China started pulling levers to control things like pharmaceuticals, and that exposed things. And then people started asking more questions like, well, electric vehicles, more. And then the semiconductors, which we're starting to see now. And that's what I believe triggered the EO 14017,
Oh yeah.
so that, it's like, hey, the policies shifted, the strategies changed. Businesses were operating on certain assumptions before, which goes back to our elements of a supply chain intelligence network. The assumptions we make, we always must constantly test and validate. And they were testing and validating and finding out that not all the players are playing by the same rules. They're using the rules, but changing how they're playing. They're not willing to necessarily give us the fair treatment of everyone. And it's not just China. You and I've talked before about how other countries have benefited from globalization, but when it came to critical things like vaccines, I think it was the bird flu before the pandemic, where Australia, Canada, and I think those are the two major ones, had contracts to make vaccines for the United States for
Went
the
out the
influenza.
window. Yep.
And as soon as the bird flu hit Canada and Australia, these are our friends, right? These are our friends. Said, you know what? We need these vaccines too. And since we have them, we're going to keep them for our people. And if we have some left over, then we'll send them and honor the contract. So I think the lesson to our buyers and category managers out there is that contracts are only good when people allow them
Yep.
to work and
Yeah.
go by the terms. And other than that, they're just pieces of paper. So building that structure and building your supply chain, your resilience is a little bit deeper than just writing contracts. You really got to dig into that. So what are
Well,
your
this
some of
really.
thoughts? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, this
Yeah,
also
exactly.
covers, right. So a lot of what I cover in chapter 2 of my book about mapping your supply chain and really understanding where even your materials are coming from, right?
Right.
Things can really be impacted, especially now geopolitical issues. It's so important now with things going around. Like I said, COVID really shook things up and created more of a nationalistic kind of approach. Talking about with China controlling the key ingredients for vaccines. When things get rough, right, you're going to take care of yourself. You're going to take care of your family, your country first, and everybody else goes right out the window, going back to your contracts, right? So really understanding where your materials are coming from. Where is it originating from? If it's all originating from one area, you want to diversify and have different places. So you don't want anything to come from the same place. And we've really learned that now. We got really reliant on just-in-time delivery, right? Or just getting stuff when we need it and expecting it to be there when we need it. And that is so not the case now,
Right.
unfortunately.
Well, I think it's, you mentioned, is getting it there, putting it in place, and really storage and looking long term. What is the real issue that I need to be aware of, that I need to be paying attention to make sure my supply chain works. And just
Yep.
because you have an agreement with somebody, I think that's my main thought when I hear this. Just because you have an agreement with someone doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to play nice.
That's
You
right.
know, agreements are only good. I'm glad the family. I always like to try to break down. We all have our own supply chain inside our own family. It's like I built, I planned, I stored for the winter. I've got all my supplies for winter, and I'm taking care of my family. And then you look to your neighbor who didn't plan. So now you have a choice. Do you share with your neighbor, or do you make sure you take care of your family? Do you plan for what you plan, execute your plan? And now you got other value. So another reason to talk and get your supply chain is looking at all your friends. And
Yep.
that's kind of starting to bring us to this modern day waiver, or the results of this supply chain resilience monitoring network based on all the key components, bringing us to this waiver that we saw with the DoD we were talking about, and we were starting looking at some other trade reports coming out for 2023, the policy that they're implementing. And when I reviewed, the outline, in digging deeper into it, it's really a lot about assuring our friends, validating our friends,
Yeah.
making sure they're still our friends, right? As well as looking at threats, making security in our supply chain. But you're in the industry, so you're like
Yep.
an industry expert right now, experiencing this firsthand. So what are
Yeah.
you seeing going on?
There's a lot of issues with capacity, and that is actually one of the key coverage of this, that EO, the Executive Order 14017, was actually covering. One of the major concerns was domestic capacity. So for people who don't understand, there's a lot of, for federal contracts, they limit the amount of things that you can get outside of your country. So about 50% of it needs to be at a minimum. We do more than that. It needs to be more domestic. Anything that's sensitive, we can't even send out of the country. So, the very simple stuff we can get out, but a lot of the more complex military related stuff we have to keep within the country. And so there's a lot of limited capacity within our country that I'm starting to notice. And that's why this executive order is trying to address that and send some of the federal money into investing into our actual supply chain, our federal supply chain. And so this one actually covers what it was called the, hold on, sorry, let me find it. Sorry. Crap. We can cut this part out.
No, I'll share some thoughts while you're researching. When I heard capacity in the government investing, and that the government's actually
Organic.
identifying this as a priority to say to private industry, we're willing to foot the bill or help invest by providing lower cost loans, access to capital that you normally wouldn't have, to guarantees on loans that you normally wouldn't get without banking, and a lot of different things. So the government's investing, realizing this structure, versus having to go out and find private equity. You now can go to the government with an appropriate program and be able to build resilience and invest into that as well. And I think capacity, you brought up capacity, is just a huge issue. People think capacity to build, capacity to store. The whole just-in-time supply chain method from 20 years ago, we used to call just isn't there. And now
Yeah.
it continues, and it starts to, since they allowed that supply chain to go overseas with oceans between us in governments that aren't necessarily friendly anymore. It's making a big difference. So what did you find? What were you thinking about when you were doing your research there?
Yeah. So this waiver for the Department of Defense covers Department of Defense, what is called the organic industrial supply base. So that's a lot of key critical supplies. For example, distributing ammo, for taking back ammo that the military uses, any kind of munitions, getting that all processed. So this is a lot of high flow, high manufacturing. Imagine we're sending a lot of that to Ukraine as well. So a lot of this stuff needs to be replenished. Our stock needs to be replenished, which affects now our own Department of Defense, right, and our own national security. So this has become a really big issue, right? And another thing is, it also is critical supply chains for electronics, kinetic capabilities, castings and forgings, which I'm personally seeing now, minerals and materials, and power and energy and storage. These are all key critical parts that the Department of Defense needs, right? It's not only just about aircraft and about flying and about strategy. It seems like we have that well under control, but now having the support system behind it, that's where we're really kind of struggling at. And that's what this waiver does. It gives the opportunity for the federal government to identify where the critical shortages are immediately, and then invest federal money into getting it back up and running. So you're saying about capacity, it's not an instantaneous thing. It's a gradual thing. Imagine some of these casting and forging houses, right? It takes millions of dollars and then years to make it grow. Who has that kind of money? And I've always wondered that. I was like, I would love to start a casting and forging place, but it costs millions of dollars.
But that's not the expensive part. Time is the expensive part. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You cannot build it any faster than what it takes to build. Years, as you mentioned. We talked about semiconductors in our last webinar, and the microchip wars and the building of infrastructure there, that they just started investing billions, which is going to take 5 to 10 years to build the infrastructure to be able to do semiconductors here in the United States at the level that they're happening in Taiwan. One thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned Ukraine, you mentioned China. There's a really good series on the Sean Ryan show. It just came out by Andrew Bustamante, where he goes and interviews a former CIA analyst or agent or officer who was actually in the field, but he really breaks down
Yep.
the Ukraine impact, what's going on there, what's true, what's not true, what's the real story and why it's important to Ukraine. And he really gets into China, the philosophy of China as a country, their culture, and what's really going on. And when I mentioned building that Silk Road, he talks about that. He talks about China's culture, saying it's a center government. They don't necessarily need to own everything, but everything needs to center around China, like lithium and
Being
electric and
China,
solar
yeah.
panels, right?
Mhm.
Pharmaceuticals. That's when you look at them owning critical components, those components that enable anything to happen. And as supply chain professionals that you and I are, and the people that watch this show are, being aware of the impacts on your supply chain, because as a professional, that's what you should be doing, looking downrange, envisioning the impact across the board will make a huge difference in doing that. So
And
anyone, as you're watching this, I'll make sure I put the link in the description. That's Sean Ryan Show. Watch those two podcasts. It's a great investment every time. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours each. And it'll bring you up to date. If you've had your head in the clouds and you've been, forget the news, talk to somebody who knows and really get to understand what's going on in these areas, because that's where things are headed. De-dollarization, oil, everything. So this is definitely worth an investment of time.
I think it's
Right?
good to also look at it from the eye of a supply chain, right? Like talking about supply chain professionals, really look at it how these now impact our supply chain. Like we never used to think about geopolitical issues really impacting supply chains as much. Now you can really start to see what's going on, and it's crazy. And another thing, going back to that podcast, was he also made a good point about China just doing things discreetly, not being too big
Right.
about it, right? They do these small moves, and that's what they're doing in their supply chain. They're collecting or they're securing the key parts, like you were saying, of the supply chain, the parts that we need, that everybody else needs. So you can say, hey, China, I need you. I have to come to you now. And, hopefully we can rewind some of that and
Right.
get back to where we
And,
need.
and it goes even deeper than just supply chain. They're not only owning
Oh, yeah.
the materials inside the supply chain, they're building the infrastructure of a supply chain, ports, key ports around the world where the materials go in and out of. There's a lot more going on there in looking at our supply chain. And it's not going to come down to the salesman, the marketing. It's not going to come down because they can sell everything all day long. The marketing's all there. The supply chain professional is going to enable delivery of all of this, manufacturing, services, cloud, everything. Everything takes a supply chain person to buy stuff and pay bills at a
Yeah.
profitable way, right? And being that ability to envision those things. So, again, as an expert in the industry right now, what are your main concerns? What are the top questions on your head every day when you're looking at your categories and you're trying to say, what should I do? What are my things? What keeps you up at night? How about that? That's a good way to say it.
For me, it's material availabilities. A lot of these issues seem to be stemming from the beginning of the supply chain, right? Where we need all the raw materials. A lot of this stuff we're not really that, I guess, secure with the United States. It's what we've been failing on, what we've been lacking on. All these things that we've been outsourcing. We do a lot of the services, the design work. We do a lot of the hard work, the intellectual part, and then we send it off to somewhere else. And usually not our friends, right? Chasing that dollar. And I'm really
They were our
interested.
friends.
Yeah, we're
They
our
were
friends.
our
Yeah.
friends.
So we thought, right? Yeah. But
Yeah.
just seeing how I'm really interested in seeing how just the impact of now the federal government stepping in to help have some kind of policy and long-term strategy on this. How's that going to impact day-to-day operations of our own supply chain, right? How is that going to help our businesses? See what some of that, like I said, going back to the 100-day review, what were some of the recommendations and how can the federal government implement it? And how does that impact all of us down to, at the private sector? Hopefully it starts helping us out because I'm starting to see lead times go up. Prices are still continuing to skyrocket. So we do really need that help,
Yeah, the 100-day review. So for everyone watching this, you may consider implementing a 100-day review of your own supply chain, looking at those critical elements, all the elements that you and I talk about in our webinar about supply chain intelligence things that you need to watch. And we talk about everything there, the logistics structure, the geopolitical structure, the data you're getting, all those different things. You got to do this 100-day review to identify those critical parts. Because if you can't get something, then you're not going to be able to deliver. And knowing you're in the federal space for federal programs, the government can extend deadlines and they can do that, but that's because their deliverable is a huge
Mhm.
system that may not be even implemented or employed or deployed, depending upon how you want to look at it, for 3 to 5 years. So it's like, okay, 12-month delay is not a big deal, but for other companies where your profits, if you don't get your profits by the end of the year, you're done, right?
Yep.
And in a volatile economy, that's going to make a big difference. So better to know now to make decisions, such as marketing decisions, that maybe we reduce our sales, not because we can't sell it, not because there's not a market for it, because there's not a supply chain to support it. And you don't put your company in a situation of over leveraged and all your capital is tied up in inventory that can't be completed because you're missing a critical component that's held by somebody else.
Well,
Does that
another
make
good
sense?
thing about, yeah, absolutely, right. Another key thing here is how now the government, we used to be just always reactive. If there's any kind of supply chain issues, the government would try to put in some policies or figure it out quickly, right? Very reactive. But now the federal government is taking a collaborative, strategic approach to
Right.
supply chain, to monitoring the supply chain, right? Working with our partners, making sure that we have every piece in the supply chain communicating with each other. If there's an issue in Taiwan, make sure that you send it out to the rest of the, the allies countries, like, hey, in the supply chain, like, hey, I'm seeing this. And that's another key principle covered in my book about supply chain resilience, right? Is looking ahead, looking at
Right.
trends, looking at things that are happening and how you can quickly adjust, not to have this rigid supply chain, right? At where it just, this is the way it needs to be. These are our only suppliers. And we've really, and this goes back to the saving money thing, right? So not only do we try to send out all of our work, but now everything's with one supplier. It takes more money to manage more suppliers, to have redundancies in your systems. But when there's an emergency, then you're going to be happy that you had it, right? And maybe you don't get the same amount of sales, amount of profit margin that you want. But if there's an emergency, what's the cost of being able to provide your products to your customer, that your supply chain can still move on, right? That you have inventory you needed, you have buffer stock. Yeah, granted, you don't want to hold it as much, but maybe analyze your inventory, your buffer stock, and say, hey, actually, I do need a little bit more. Granted, it affects how much money I have, right? Net working capital. But at the end of the day, isn't it about making sure that your customer always has the product when they need it, in the right price, in the right quantity, at
Mhm.
the right time? And if you're running
And,
lean, yeah,
and
what's that,
it goes
Ryan?
back to the ROI, or the business case analysis, cost versus benefit, is what's the
That's right.
most expensive part of any business? It's customer acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not unable to deliver, your customer has to go somewhere else. There's that cost of acquisition that you initially had is now gone, right? Because now you get then that customer somewhere else, and then you got to get them back. So if you think about the cost of getting them back, then you start to evaluate your ROI, not only the lost sales, but then add in cost of acquisition of getting the customer back. There's
Oh,
another level of thought to take it to say, why should I invest in a redundant supply chain? Why should I enable more than one, two, three suppliers in a specific category? Why should I, well, reverse marketing, building suppliers now, before there's a crisis, and making some tough decisions here, and that's a lot of reason we wanted to get this word out and get people talking, with
oh yeah.
de-dollarization out there and the things becoming aware of what's going on, the critical elements of
Key
supply
events,
chain,
current events.
key
Yeah.
events, a lot of things happening very quickly. And when I say quickly, I mean, we talked about globalization took what, after World War II, or no, it was the first President Bush, 88. He's the one that started to really push globalization with NAFTA and other free trade agreements, and
Trade,
started
yeah.
to get that out there. So 88 till now, what's that? 40, 50 years. 50 years to get to where we are today. And within weeks, from just the beginning of this year, things started to fall apart. Pandemic started it, the thinking, But deglobalization started really happening really quick when countries started
Yeah.
saying, hey, this is thing. I think the Ukraine invasion was the catalyst that really got people concerned about what's going on out there, right? And that the countries are like, yeah, I know we're all friends at the end of the day, but I got to still take care of my people. And
So where
making
do
a
you balance
big
that,
difference.
right? It's like, how do you
Right.
work with other countries but still protect yourself? We got so much about working with other countries that we forgot to also, take care of ourselves. And it seems like that's a lot of things with like reshoring, right? People start country manufacturer trying to bring some of that back, try to build more resilience, right? Trying to capture some of that back into the United States. And you're starting to see it now, to see you talking about that, right? Like, yeah, we do need to work with our supply partners in other countries. We do need other countries. The United States can't fully do everything on their own, but we have to do it carefully and with some kind of strategy and policy, right? Trade policy. That's another big one that's coming down. That's another demonstration of the executive order is now more trade policy in place.
Right. And I think that's where we also need to validate our assumptions when it comes to our friends.
Yep.
And the reason you and I talked about this last week, that a company in Alabama that produces a key ingredient for concrete for construction in Mexico, and they own the mine, they own the land in Mexico legally, and it's theirs. And the Mexican government sent in their military to capture that port and to use that port for the Mexican companies to be able to
Yikes.
export ingredients, deep things. So it goes back to validating your friends. Yes, Mexico is supposed to be our friends. We are great trading partners. We have a lot of things. But when Mexico says it's you or me, they're going to go back to, well, it's me. I got to take care of my people first,
Yep.
and who are they making friends with, and who are they making alliances with, and those type of things. So these are all key pieces for people to think about. So when we think about this stuff as professionals in here, how would you recommend our out there to start looking at these let's just say their category or their supply chain, their specific thing? How do they need to start looking at this stuff and preparing?
Key thing for this specific issue is, you said it again, map your supply chain. You really need to truly understand where your material is coming from, your suppliers, suppliers, right? Your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Where's your raw material coming from? Probably not want to
Right.
be too happy to know where it's actually coming from, but it's critical to understand, right, where your supply chain is and where stuff are coming from. Also look at it from a capacity standpoint, going back to capacity, right? What is your capacity within a certain country? Does it have the ability to take on more work if you need it? Does it also have the ability to downsize if you need it? This goes back to having geographically dispersed supply chain. It's okay to have different countries have different supply chains. You have a supply chain ecosystem in Europe, having diverse ecosystem supply chain in China, or not in China, but in Asia, and then have one in the United States, having a good balance, not just having everything located or concentrated in one area. And that really has bit us in the butt this last couple of years, when we're having all this concentration of certain commodities, certain items only being built in one country, which gives them more of the power to cut us off if we need to, right? Like you said, going back to personal interests. If it's better personal interests, if things are going bad, probably going to worry about yourself first. So definitely need to consider that.
Right.
Consider what are my own manufacturing capabilities, and where are my key suppliers, and where are they sourcing from? Where is this material coming from? Is it reliable? And then also another key thing that we just discussed too, which you need to really also take into consideration, because it's been such a topic, right? Supply chain procurement has always been about saving money, right? How do we save money? How do we lean this out? How do we carry the least amount of inventory without tying up our capital? And that's a thing of the past. We need to really focus on, right, balancing cost versus risk. How can I have an acceptable amount of inventory? I can make sure that I'm covered enough, that I have enough suppliers, that I have an ample amount of supplier and redundancy in my supply chain, so that when something happens, I'll still be okay.
So if I were to list those steps that you just went through, and I'll go through them, and then if you have another or some things we need to kind of
Cool.
go down, then we'll go through those. So step one was map your supply chain all the way down to the raw material, all the way down,
Material. Yep.
all the way down to the raw material. Balance your supply chain with through in different countries or different suppliers that you have redundancy. So map balance redundancy in your supply chain. So you're not relying on any one country, one supplier, one source of goods, that you got a good redundant balancing. And then really evaluate not only your suppliers' capabilities, their capacity to manufacture and store, but your own internal capacities. Because if
That's
you
right.
bring in a lot of raw materials, you got to make sure you have a place to store it. And then next, you have the ability to process it, especially if we're talking about things that are spoilable or pilferable,
To
things
consume. Yep.
to consume. And then look downstream at your suppliers, all the way down, all of their issues as well, and really drill down your supply chain. And then cost versus risk. All of this rolls up into that resilience index that you talk about. We talked about in a few webinars back, where
Oh
you're
yeah.
building that resilience index to really understand each category. And that's a good way to organize it, is look at each category, because they're going to have common suppliers, common materials across the board, and you're building this process. So it's going to take time. It's going to take time in addition to everything else you have going on day in, day out, or special capabilities by bringing in other people that can do this type of analysis when they're learning it or developing this process. And it's not something to rely on others to do for you. Yes, there are intelligence out there like Gartner, someone we've mentioned in the past, that you have to be able to look at their information, but then balance that with other information, what we call
And personal experience.
triangulation,
Yeah.
personal experience, other industry reports, Gartner
Use
intelligence,
your
all these.
suppliers.
Bingo, right there. Man, you just nailed it. Your suppliers. And we talked about that before, where your suppliers are a key element of information. Now, how do you use your suppliers to gather information? What are some things that you do?
Oh man. Yeah, definitely. I think having that good relationship with them, having that collaborative approach. A
Yeah.
lot of times I ask just about every month, I ask suppliers, hey, what are you guys seeing? What are some of the issues you're seeing from you and from your suppliers, right? Why is it? Another good thing to do is ask questions. That's a great way. Say, hey, my lead time went up 25% from last week. What is the reasoning for that? Or, hey, my price increased 30%. It was, X, Y, and Z a couple months ago. Now it's skyrocketed 30%. Why, right? A lot of all of this stuff is why, right? To dig down, to get down to the nitty gritty, to get through the details. Because having the details allows you to make more informed decisions. You said going back to your suppliers and asking them what they're seeing, so they can provide you feedback too. Depending on where you are in the supply chain, they may be a little bit more further down the supply chain than you. For example, like us working at my company, being more on the end of it, where we're manufacturing the whole goods, I can ask like my suppliers who do fasteners, ask my suppliers who do washers, my raw material suppliers. Hey, what are you guys seeing? You guys are several tiers removed from me. What are you seeing? And I can really give you a good overall picture of what's happening in your supply chain. And it also helps you kind of remove some of your bias, right? Because you may think this is the reasoning, and they may give you other reasons. So they can give you different viewpoints, diverse viewpoints, which is always great.
And building that relationship. When you said supplier relationships being key, the
Oh yeah,
days of drilling down, negotiating down, and really hurting your suppliers are just long gone. You got to have solid
partners.
relationships, and it takes time. Again, time to build this stuff. Nothing happens overnight. The analysis,
Oh yeah,
the movement of materials, the building capacity, understanding your suppliers, building strategic relationships. And I don't even want to put a technical term like strategic relationships on it, because strategic, well, the strategic is that corporate, he's involved, the CEO is involved in the strategic relationship. But at the end of the day, who executes the relationship? The buyer. They
yeah.
ultimately make the decision who they're going to spend money with, no matter what the CEO, COO, CFO are dictating in policy. They'll do their best to do it. But at the end of the day, the ground level, they're the folks that have to execute the policy. So, their education and their training to understand this stuff. So some CEOs and CFOs who may be watching this saying, yeah, we got this, we got the right policies in place. My challenge to you is to drill down into your buyers and say, buyers, do you understand? What am I not seeing at the executive level? You know, we've talked many times in the military, like the strategic lance corporal who can make a decision that can throw off the entire strategic plan at today's, especially in today's world.
Another thing
Same
too,
thing
Randy,
here. Your
about this
buyer.
though. Yeah, and definitely from a buyer standpoint too, is one thing that we always say too is that supply chain doesn't only manage product, we also manage information. And information can go both ways, right? You can have strategy coming down the pipe, but you can also send it back up saying, hey, this is what I'm seeing, right? Tell the levels above you that, hey, this is boots on ground intelligence that I'm seeing, right? I'm seeing this specific commodity going up. We need to look into it. Send it up the chain, send it up the flagpole, right? Let everybody else know, especially for buyers who are boots on ground, dealing in the market directly. It's a great source of intelligence that can go back up the chain, change our strategy, and then it goes back down. It's both ways, two-way street.
And the chain needs to listen. You know, the buyer going to that manager going to that director going to that vice president, vice president tapping into this chief executive suite. And, you know, you don't have time for bureaucracy right now, right? If the buyer says this commodity is becoming an issue, they got to bump it up and bump it up and bump it up. If they need to release funds and finance to get things secured now, that's what they need to do. And you don't have a month to make a decision. And especially at the corporate level, especially some large corporations where bureaucracy drives everything.
Oh yeah.
Think about the banking issues, how rapidly they changed in like the last 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks, you know, SVB, a capital or a venture capital bank went down. Okay, it's the venture capital investors, don't worry about it. But then Swiss Credit went down, which is a major bank. And looking at the strategies, the way those banks operate compared to other banks where your money might be, what's really going on there, right? And just drilling into that stuff and start asking. You don't have 30 days to make a decision. You know, do you want money in a currency that may not be worth as much tomorrow? Or do you want it into materials that you can transform into value and sell at the new value based on the current economy, whatever current means at that time? Does that make sense?
And definitely it's what that waiver kind of shows. It does show, right? Is the federal government is also realizing this now. And that's why he signed that, hey, we need to be able to make decisions quickly and sooner, right? These other countries are catching up to us because we're doing all this bureaucratic stuff and signing all this paperwork and tons of paperwork and do this, do that, right? The waiver says, hey, you know, if it's important enough, let's get it moving quickly.
Right. And it goes and one point I want to make there is that the government's taking care of who? The government, right? Yeah. Not the private companies who are selling to customers necessarily, because how many cell phones do you need? How many computers? How fast does it need to be? You know, they're looking at how do I protect the government, protect the country, protect the infrastructure, the DoD. So if you're not a company in this area, you could be impacted. Have you seen any of that? Has that ever happened where a company who's not necessarily involved in the government contracts getting affected by lack of waiver authority or lack of priority? Have you seen that?
Yeah, that's actually happening now with the increase in commercial orders with like the 787, with Boeing hiring 10,000 people, right? So a lot of for us, especially in the aerospace industry where there's a lot of complexity in our parts, there's only a certain amount of suppliers that have the capability of doing this, and everybody's all going to the same supplier. Well, going back to the limited capacity within the American supply base, now you have conflicting priorities with government and commercial purchase orders,
right,
in one supplier, right? And by federal regulation, which is called DFARS, Defense Acquisition Regulation, anything that has a priority, which is DPAS, which stands for Defense Priority Allocation System, if it's a rated order, meaning it has a DPAS rating on it, by federal law, they have to take care of that first because it's about defense of our nation, right? So national defense. So right now, what is happening, a lot of these commercial orders are just keep getting bumped out, right? Imagine you're about third on the list, like, oh, about to go, and another government order comes in, and then Uncle Sam cuts in line in front of you. and it just continues to cut in
This prom
line,
night,
cut in
denied.
line. Right, and that's what I've seen happening now. Is, you know, a lot of these commercial orders are now getting pushed down because you keep getting more priority orders coming in.
And think about, go even one step deeper, is that parts for the aerospace industry are one thing, but materials used to make parts start to even spread that spider web out a little bit further.
Oh yeah, and
Copper,
everybody's fighting
metals,
for it.
right? Everyone wants that same metal, down to the raw materials used to produce finished goods, used to go into military type or government type projects, but also go into civilian type projects, construction, and all those other things. That's
Another
even
thing too,
another level.
Randy. Yeah, and another thing
Yeah.
too right now is with a lot of this more product getting more complex, especially in the aerospace industry again, where the complex aluminum alloys and all that kind of stuff, it's harder to get. There's only a limited, even more limited places where you can get it. So now it gets even harder, right? All these things are getting more complex. Things are harder to make, which brings up another thing, Randy, is, you know, another concern is, do we have the capability in our employee base, you know, for the people to be, do we have the talent in order to make these new complex things? Do we have the base? So that's another key issue, right? Do we have enough people, talented people enough to do what we need done in a more complex manufacturing world that we're in now?
Hopefully it comes back here in a second.
Yeah, I got you. Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So, you know, just I was mentioning, and what you just said is, it's more than just materials. It's more than procurement. It's more than contracts. It's talent. It's people. It's capacity. All these different things, and just to make it simple for people, and that's kind of the hard part of this entire discussion. How do we make it simple for people to understand? We gave them the steps: map, balance, redundancy, capabilities, downstream suppliers, cost versus risk. We talked about relationships, making sure you have the right relationships in place, looking at your supply chain across the board and evaluating risk, and not only looking down the supply chain at countries and resources, but now look across the board at competing industries who may have a higher priority in this DPAS system than you, which takes it even another level. So, you know, there's a lot of different things to think
To
about.
consider. Oh yeah, and it's a complex supply chain world now that we live. We're
Yep.
not just placing orders anymore. There's just so much to consider. Like you said, down to the buyer level, you got to consider all these things before you send out a purchase order, right? Then a day, you have to think about, when I place this order, am I really going to get it on time, right? Yeah, maybe, right? Or will the cheapest guy give it to me on time? We need to also consider that now, because delivery is now concerned, not only quality and price. You can also consider about resilience and delivery.
And I'll throw one last curveball in as we kind of start to wrap this up, is the value of the dollar, the de-dollarization conversation, that you've set a contract for a certain amount. It's not deliverable till 6 months. And then 6 months from now, the value of the dollar is not what it used to be. And they say, yep, we had a deal, but sorry, the economy's changed. We can't deliver like that, you know, and you have to pay more. You know, can you facilitate that? Can you come up with the funding? Can you have that kind of conversation? And again, that's long-term thinking. And that, what do you do now to secure your supply chain? Do you pay the bill now? You know, but then you still don't own it or possess it. And I think that's another key point from our discussion we've had this evening, is that it's about ownership. Ownership, 9/10 of the law. Being able to have that.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
So what are some final parting thoughts as we kind of start to wrap this up for people to think about? We'll talk about
resilience. Is, like I always say, resilience is not something that you do overnight. Resilience is a constant thing. It's a mindset. We went over how many different things to consider, right? Consider just a few of them and continue to work at it. But resilience needs to be on everybody's mind. It needs to be a mindset. It needs to be a constantly work that needs to be strategic. There needs to be strategy involved, right? And it needs to also be aligned with tactical actions. And that's what I would leave you with.
Yeah, and to highlight your book that people can get, where they can go to hnap.com.
Yep.
HKNAPP.
Not NAP, take a nap, which I like to do.
Right. I'll show that. Is that show hnap.com. You have to go there, pick up a chapter of Howard's book here, which we have here. You can all see that right there. You know,
What
and you can pick up a free chapter to learn more about this. And of course, you can pick up a copy on Amazon.com, pick up your own copy, but definitely go to the website, get that free chapter, learn more about this. There's a lot more detail in there than what we're discussing here. We talk a lot about what's going on right now. Absolutely. But it's kind of, you got to do the deeper dive. You got to get into this and make a difference for that.
And that book covers a lot of that stuff on there. It talks about actionable things you can do right now. It doesn't even cost money. It's a mindset. It's a strategy. There's different strategies. It's educating. It gives a lot. It focuses on resilience and things that you can apply, things that you can do to help your supply chain from the buyer all the way up to the CEO level. So hnap.com, there's also a link in there where you can go and click and not only get a free chapter in my book, to also be caught up with any kind of new material that's coming out. And then there's also a link on there that you can go directly to the Amazon website and buy my book. Cheap, best investment you'll make.
And what's the better way to contact you, or the best way to contact you? Is it your website, LinkedIn? Where's the best way to get a hold of you?
You can also go onto my LinkedIn website. It's Howard Knapp CPSM. So LinkedIn.com, Howard Knapp CPSM.
Okay. So if you have more questions for Howard and want to drill more into having a conversation with him to learn more about what he's thinking and maybe discuss some of the topics in his book, reach out to him on LinkedIn so that he can have that conversation with you and you can start to build resilience into your supply chain. And we've stressed it a couple of times here. Time is not your friend. Nothing stops the clock. You have to think about this stuff now, start taking action. And action can be as little as just writing stuff down and mapping your supply chain, which was the top recommendation Howard had for today. Was start there, map your supply chain, and then drill down from there. Okay. So any parting thoughts, and then we're gonna sign off here.
Yeah, that's all I had. Those are my parting thoughts earlier.
All right, sounds good. We'll talk to you soon.